Thanks for joining us. I'm Mike Montecalvo, along with Eyewitness News analyst Lieutenant General Reginald Centracchio. Big topic today, General, on our web exclusive is more confidential documents are released by WikiLeaks, the latest about 250,000 U.S. diplomatic cables. So every week we're seeing more and more being released. No surprises?
Well, no surprises. I think they told us that was going to happen over the last several weeks, but what is most disturbing is in all of those documents, it's really a damaging scenario to many of our allies, knowing that things are said from time to time in a matter of taking out of context, and if you might refer to someone as perhaps not in a laudatory way, it's being misconstrued as to being overly not so much complimentary. The other side of that would suggest that we're not friendly with this particular country. But in essence, we are. I think the best comeback was when someone from another country says, well, that's not bad, you should see what we talk about with you. And so I think that's the only salvation that many of them understand, that this kind of stuff happens. My big concern is that this past week, part of that whole release had to do with the infrastructure of the entire world. That is very disturbing, because what it did was give a blueprint to the terrorists that, if you do this, this will happen. If you do that, that'll happen. And it really touches the essence of world security, not so much of the United States, which is obviously important to us, but world security.
When something like this happens, do you kind of change the playbook at that point because the terrorists know what we're planning? Or there's just like no turning back?
It's no turning back, because it's physically impossible to give the kind of physical security to each of those places in the infrastructure. It's impossible. And so when it's a matter of playing chess at this particular point. They put us in check. We have to make sure they don't put us in checkmate. When checkmate happens, God forbid if it ever does, then there'll be no turning back whatsoever.
Well, Mastercard, Visa, Amazon.com, PayPal, they've all cut their ties with WikiLeaks. So now hackers have rushed to kind of WikiLeaks' defense, and they've been launching attacks against Mastercard.com and hacking in. Is that a form of terrorism?
Well, I think you could certainly refer to it as terrorism, but I think it's more of a mimicking of what they'd like to see someone else take credit for. We have hackers every day of the week trying to break into the DoD network systems. Some have been very successful on occasion. But I think we have to understand, too, that terrorism is a word. Whether it's being used for terrorism against the United States or whether it's being used to a particular company, the differentiation is, are we looking at the sovereignty of a nation that's being attacked, or are we looking at the sovereignty of a particular company? Both has its particular application, but terrorism is terrorism. We yet to see who's going to come forward to claim the break-ins for the against the different cardholders.
Well, Mastercard did acknowledge that a service disruption involving their security code system did take place. How widespread could this get?
It could get tremendously widespread. When you look at someone being able to attack and compromise the basic foundation of any system, that gives you unlimited links to go to other parts of that. In other parts of that, when you put it all together, you have a technical puzzle, and an information technology puzzle that can, in fact, be put together and compromise an entire organization. So I think that's what we're seeing here. If they put this piece together and this piece and this little link with this one, you will certainly see a larger scale operation being given to a particular entity within our economy. And that could be scary all by itself. If you shut down the credit card systems in the United States, our economy will undoubtedly suffer.
Well, Senator Joe Lieberman is the chair of the Homeland Security Committee. He is looking to see if this is a possibility of U.S. espionage laws, that if they've been broken by these hackers.
Well, I think clearly it is when you look at them trying to break into DoD network and the Pentagon systems. Now, as far as private industry is concerned, I'm not sure how that falls out within the espionage laws of the United States. It could be interpreted as that, because it is, in effect, affects the economy of the country, which in effect deals with national security of the country. So it depends on how they go about it, and whether in fact they can have someone to target to be able to forward a particular prosecution of a particular law that might be applicable to this.
You know, last week we talked about the information that was leaked, and it said Afghanistan's president was weak and paranoid. He was confronted with that this week. He kind of took the high road and didn't say anything. That was kind of the smart thing to do. Do you think the United States actually asked him not to say anything?
I think there was probably some dialogue. I'm not sure that there was any specific instructions to him, but I think they made him understand through the dialogue that a continued path along the lines of him being referred to as weak and indecisive, and certainly to some extent over to the left with the Taliban, is counterproductive as to why we're there to begin with. And so I think he probably understands that. Maybe he doesn't understand, even at this point, that when he says something or does something, it's of national and worldwide concern. So you can't come across as saying, come and help us, and yet when you're there helping him, he does something totally different and makes the kind of comments that he's been making and the kind of action that he's been doing over the last several months.
So at the end of the day, you know, are the decisions based by world leaders on their own interest and not really what's leaking out here?
I think so. I think that's a fair statement. But I think you have to add a living, somewhat of an ingredient, which to some extent dilutes the corrosive aspects of something you might say against another country. But every leader has got to have his own or her own country in the first and foremost of their mind when they're making decisions. And that's no different with the United States or any other country. But I think you also have to be sensitive that when you're talking about your allies, you're talking about you're very sustaining those allies for your own purpose of national security.
One thing the United States is looking at this week again is not only the 30,000 troop surge in Afghanistan, but the pullout date has been brought up again today by Defense Secretary Gates to see if that's going to be possible.
You know, they're talking about 2014, and we've talked about this before. I think that's only as viable as the ground situation allows it to be. Can, in fact, the Afghan security forces and military take care of its own country? That's yet to be determined. The same thing applies to Iraq. You know, we have ups and downs there. How influential is the Taliban going to be should they start to have negotiations with the Taliban? What part are they going to play? And will the actual pullout date be moved because that might be a stipulation for the Taliban to back off? You know, all those things are so uncertain. But undoubtedly, to set a date saying it's going to be 2014, I think, is unrealistic because it's all based upon a day-to-day unfolding of their own ability to maintain their own security.
Yeah, mentioning the Taliban, General, we're finding out this week that they're losing some of their stronghold in parts of Afghanistan and Iraq.
Oh, they did. But I think if we look at the particular place we're talking about, and you're referring to the Marine General talking about we've gained this land and we're never going to lose it again. Well, if we look at Iraq as an example, the southern part of Iraq was pretty secure when the Brits were there. When they moved out, parts of that became obviously, a bedding place, if you will, to Al-Qaeda. Could the same thing happen in Afghanistan with the Taliban? Sure. You know, if we don't keep the resources in place and we back off a little bit, that void will be filled by either individuals sympathetic to the Taliban cause or the Taliban themselves.
You're talking about backing off. Eventually that's going to happen, though, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah, eventually we cannot stay as a police force in all these countries all at the same time for unlimited amounts of time. We've got to make sure that Afghanistan, Iraq, and other countries across the world can fend for themselves, and we've got to be able to understand that at some point in the future we will, of necessity, have to take our troops back significantly and perhaps keep a keeping force there to give them the proper guidance from time to time. But eventually, we're going to have to make the decision to back out.
Moving on, Iran says it will agree to the talks in 2011 in Turkey, the nuclear talks. However, President Ahmadinejad did say that he will not participate in the talks unless some of the sanctions are lifted, the UN sanctions lifted against his country. Is he dreaming there?
Well, I think that further shows you that he can, on one hand, say the sanctions not bothering him at all, and he said that on numerous occasions. On the other hand, he's saying, in order for me to continue talking, especially about the nuclear, but you got to remove the sanctions. So it's double talking, and it's somewhat of a a counterproductive approach that he's taking. One hand he's saying you're not bothering us, the other hand he's saying you are. In order for us to talk, you need to remove the sanctions. So that tells me sanctions are in fact working.
Or could it be that he wants to see what he can get away with?
That's possible too. Keep in mind, we look. This is just like a playbook. If you look at I'm trying to draw an analogy between the Republican Party and Democrat Party. And I'm not trying to draw the analogy of Taliban and Al-Qaeda. I'm not doing that. But everybody has a playbook. If we're smart enough, we'll look at the playbook that Al-Qaeda used in Iraq. And we'll understand that, and this was during Saddam's reign, they're using the same playbook that Saddam used with refusing to allow UN security personnel to go in and check out the country. No, we're not going to let you in. You need to do this. You've got to come back. We don't have this. We don't trust you. You're spies. You're not inspectors. Very same thing happened.
Well, Saddam got away with it for decades.
13 years he got away with it, and that gave him much time, as we're finding out now, that there were, in fact, weapons of mass destruction throughout Iraq. And they gave him 13 years to divest himself of that. And I think we're doing the same thing with Ahmadinejad, giving him the opportunity to say, you can't come in, we'll tell you when you can come in, you're spies, we don't want you. And that gives him a lot of maneuverability to eventually obtain, in my opinion, nuclear capability.
This week marks the 69th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Many ceremonies have taken place over the last week. I know you participated in one of them. It happened December 7th, 1941. What have we learned since then?
Well, I think we've learned one thing, and that is to ensure that we don't have a standby military. And that was the case pre-World War II. We had much of our stand-down military. The Army and our military was taken way down after World War I, and we just let it deteriorate. And then we went to World War II with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. We had to make a retrofit of all of our industry to go back to a war-making capability. I think we've learned that you can't do that. You can't become so complacent in our ability to be able to respond, especially today. World War II was a time when we still used telephones to talk to each other. Today, it's instantaneous. And I think we need to understand that you can't build an army as a matter of a couple of hours, which would be the case should we be attacked somewhere, unlike Pearl Harbor. Today, it's instantaneous response that we have to have.
And finally, General, closer to home, we're hearing from Rhode Island Governor Don Carcieri. He's on, obviously, his last leg of 8 years in the state capitol. And he is telling Governor-elect Lincoln Chafee to kind of slow down on his appointments, to kind of look at the landscape, so to speak, before he starts making his selections. Good idea, or is this something that all governors do, and maybe even Carcieri did this himself? Well,
I think Carcieri, I got to say something with Carcieri. He didn't make decisions that were immediate. There was a lot of dissecting that particular decision, that particular policy, so I got to credit him with that. But at the same time, I think it's okay for you to say something once you've been in the seat to make those observations. But I also recognize that the Senator Chafee, Governor-elect Chafee now, was trying to make his case based upon his time in the Senate and his time as mayor. And Carcieri picked that up and say they're totally different than being in a governor's seat. Well, at the same time, I recognize that, but Carcieri's never been a senator, he's never been a mayor. So I think everything has its place, but I think the advice on the front end is that he should take more time before making major policy decisions such as E-Verify and perhaps making appointments right off the top of his administration before it even starts.
Well, one of the things he did do, he met with Brendan Doherty from the state police. He's retaining him. A.T. Wall from the ACA is also being retained. Those are kind of the first two pieces of the puzzle. That's not something that's really quick. Most governors actually would look at that first.
Yeah, I think so. I think as in the case with both Alman and as well as Carcieri during my office time, those decisions were not made until after the inauguration. And I think that's perhaps a wise thing to do until you've had an opportunity to get a briefing. And I'm not sure that he hasn't received briefings, but the normal consequences, you receive a briefing on the state police, the direction of the corrections department, the Guard, and other major facilities, especially public safety. Because the time, and the several times that I've gone to different meetings with governors, they all said in the first 6 months of your administration, you will be tested with some significant challenge. And that has been the case, as far as I can see, through 7 governors that I serve with. Something always happens within the first 6 months of significance. You've got to depend on the state police, you've got to depend on the Guard, you've got to depend on those major facilities and agencies that will keep public safety in tow.
Okay, General Centracchio, as always, thank you very much.
Here.
Thanks for watching.